It was supposed to be a power move, a classic Trump lever pulled in full view of the cameras, designed to do what it has always done: force a neighbor to flinch, dominate the news cycle, and reaffirm that in the new global order, American intimidation remains the only currency that matters. Instead, what unfolded in a matter of minutes was not a routine diplomatic scuffle. It was a political earthquake with a hypoenter in Ottawa, and aftershocks already rattling Washington boardrooms, European capitals, and the trading floors of New York. This was the moment the temperature of an entire geopolitical relationship changed in a single afternoon. One statement, one response, one miscalculation, so severe that the shockwave is still moving through campaign war rooms and corporate strategy sessions as we speak. What just happened between Prime Minister Mark Carney and former President Donald Trump was not another noisy headline designed to burn hot for 6 hours and vanish by morning. This felt bigger, sharper, more dangerous. And for Trump, it is proving far more costly than anyone in his inner circle anticipated. Carney did not just push back, he reset the battlefield. He took a pressure move designed to extract weakness and turned it into a vulnerability. He took a threat intended to create panic and turned it into leverage. He took a show of force and turned it into a spectacle of overreach. And now Washington is dealing with the consequences in real time. Not next week, not after the spin machine kicks in, but right now as markets adjust and allies recalibrate. This is not merely about two powerful men trading blows across a political border. This is about whether intimidation still works when the target refuses to flinch. It is about whether economic threats can still dominate a neighboring ally when the response is disciplined, credible, and designed not for a 6-hour news cycle, but for the power structure underneath it. We are talking about markets, supply chains, institutional credibility, investor confidence, diplomatic alignment, and the brutal reality that in a high-stakes confrontation, the side that keeps its nerve often wins before the other side even understands it is losing. What unfolded here is not a policy dispute, it is a power struggle. And Donald Trump just discovered that the old playbook, the one built on volume, velocity, and the assumption that the other side will always blink, does not always survive first contact with a prepared opponent. Let's walk through exactly what happened in that exchange. Because the immediate event is everything, Trump made the kind of move he loves to make. Loud, public, dominant in tone. It was designed to project control before the dust even settled. The message was unmistakable. Pressure, urgency, strength. The assumption behind it was just as clear. Push hard enough, speak forcefully enough, create enough noise, and the other side either backs down, softens, or starts negotiating from fear. That is the model. That is the instinct. That is the performance. But what happened next is where the whole thing turned. Carney did not answer with panic. He did not answer with outrage for its own sake. He did not answer by matching Trump decel for decel, because that would have been fighting on Trump's terrain, a terrain designed to reward chaos. Instead, Carney answered with the one thing that can puncture a pressure campaign faster than any insult ever could: cold strategic clarity. The tone mattered. The language mattered. The sequencing mattered. It was measured without being weak, direct without being theatrical, firm without sounding impulsive, and that combination is precisely what made it so devastating, because when one side is trying to dominate the emotional atmosphere and the other side responds like it has already game-theorized the entire confrontation 3 steps ahead, the aggressor suddenly looks less powerful, not more. Picture the scene. Cameras up, statements moving instantly across every network and platform, analysts trying to catch up in real time, political aides refreshing feeds, market participants reading beyond the words into the implications, and then Carney's response lands and the energy shifts. You can feel it. The conversation stops being how far will Trump go and becomes, did Trump just trigger something he cannot easily control? That is the pivot. That is the humiliation. Because for a move like this to work, it has to create fear. It has to create hesitation. Instead, it created consolidation on the other side and doubt on his own. Here is what this means. Carney understood that the real audience was never just Trump. The real audience was everyone watching how Trump's pressure would be handled. Investors deciding whether instability was becoming a structural risk. Allies deciding whether alignment with Washington now comes with increasing volatility. Corporations deciding whether political escalation would hit their bottom lines. And voters deciding who looked serious when the stakes stopped being symbolic and started becoming material. Carney's response was crafted for that larger audience. That is why it hit so hard. He was not merely rebutting Trump, he was isolating Trump. And that tells you everything you need to know about why this backfired worse than expected. Trump's move appears to have been designed as a test of dominance. The assumption was that a hard line would force retreat or concession, but a dominance test only works if the other side accepts the frame. Carney rejected the frame completely. He reframed the confrontation not as Trump imposing terms, but as Canada defending institutional stability, economic sovereignty, and strategic credibility against reckless coercion. That is a completely different story. It turns the aggressor into the risk factor. It turns the target into the adult in the room. And once that narrative hardens, the balance of pressure changes immediately. Let's walk through the mechanics, because they are brutally important. Trump's political power thrives on asymmetry. He hits first loudly and forces everyone else to react to him. That gives him tempo. Tempo creates intimidation. Intimidation creates concessions. But Carney's response disrupted the tempo. Instead of chasing Trump's escalation, he slowed the frame down and made the costs visible, not abstract costs, real costs. Economic spillover, market uncertainty, cross-border damage, strategic mistrust, institutional backlash. Suddenly, the issue was no longer whether Trump sounded strong. The issue was whether he had just destabilized a relationship too important to weaponize carelessly. That shift is catastrophic for the original strategy, because strength theater is much less effective when audiences start calculating price, tags, and make no mistake, this is where the deeper strategic layer appears. Carr's background matters in a confrontation like this because he speaks the language of credibility, risk, and systemic consequence. He understands something many political operators either miss or underestimate. In moments of confrontation, markets don't just listen to who is angrier. They listen to who sounds governable. Institutions don't just react to threat volume. They react to who appears capable of managing second-order effects. Allies don't just watch for toughness. They watch for reliability. Carney's response was devastating because it was calibrated to those audiences. Trump aimed at headlines. Carney aimed at trust, and in a crisis atmosphere, trust is a strategic weapon. But the public exchange was only the visible layer. The more important story is what this did behind the scenes. Because behind the scenes is where the backfire becomes undeniable. The moment Carney answered with control instead of panic. Every stakeholder who had hoped this would remain a manageable confrontation had to reassess. Advisors started gaming out retaliation. Business leaders started asking whether this would disrupt investment decisions. Supply chain planners started imagining friction. Diplomats started making calls. Surrogates started testing arguments. Legal teams began reviewing authorities. Internal discussions turned from "can we pressure them" to "can we contain this?" And that is the moment the operation changes character. A pressure campaign becomes a damage control campaign. A planned escalation becomes an exposed gamble. You can almost see the split-screen version of the story. In Ottawa, disciplined language, strategic messaging, deliberate posture. In Trump world, a burst of heat, then a scramble to shape the fallout, then a search for a new line of attack that doesn't look like retreat. That is a hard position to occupy because once a threat fails to produce submission, it loses some of its mystique. And once it starts producing costs for your own side, it becomes politically radioactive. The problem for them is simple. Every effort to intensify now risks proving Carney's point about recklessness. And every effort to soften risks confirming that the original move failed. That is not leverage, that is entrapment. And this is why the response feels so bruising for Trump personally and strategically. His political identity depends heavily on perceived dominance. He can survive outrage. He can survive controversy. He can survive endless media storms. What is much harder to survive, especially in a high-profile confrontation, is visible resistance that looks effective, not emotional resistance. Effective resistance, resistance that absorbs the blow, returns it with structure, and leaves your own side asking whether this was worth it. That is the dangerous kind. That is the kind that spreads. What happened next only intensified that perception. Media reaction shifted quickly from spectacle to consequence. The language changes when a story stops being entertainment and becomes a risk event. Coverage started focusing on fallout. Commentators started asking whether Trump misread the room. Financial voices began weighing in. Political allies became more careful with their wording. Some went silent, and silence in moments like this is never neutral. Silence is often a warning sign. Silence means people are waiting to see whether this gets worse before they fully attach themselves to it. Silence means confidence is not complete. Let's look at 3 immediate implications because this is where the wider meaning of the story comes into focus. First, this exposed a weakness in Trump's coercive model. Not that he cannot still create fear. He can. Not that he cannot still dominate headlines. He can. But this showed that if the opposing side answers quickly, coherently, and with institutional credibility, the intimidation cycle can be broken. That matters far beyond this one confrontation. It tells every government, every negotiator, every political rival, and every major stakeholder that the key is not to outshout him. The key is to deny him psychological control of the scene. Carney did that cleanly. Second, this elevated Carr's stature instantly. Moments like this are leadership tests, and leadership tests are rarely passed by sounding the most emotional. They are passed by sounding the most composed under maximum pressure. Carney came across not as a man dragged into Trump's drama, but as a strategist using Trump's